Hi guys. Tonight we begin with something both unsettling and oddly calming, the way candlelight once flickered across medieval cloisters, brushing the edges of silence with shadows that told more than the official rules ever admitted. You picture yourself inside the stone corridors of a convent somewhere in 14th century France. The air is cool, the smell of beeswax heavy, and the faint scrape of sandals on flagstones echoes faintly. At first glance, everything seems orderly, disciplined, and detached from the messy world outside. But as you linger, you realize that human desire does not vanish simply because vows of chastity were spoken. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who else is drifting off around the world together with you tonight. Now dim the lights, and you'll feel the quiet draw you in as the story flows forward. The cloister was supposed to be a fortress of virtue. Records confirm that church councils in the 13th century specifically issued decrees about separating nuns from outside influence, locking convent gates, and limiting contact with visitors. The very architecture, grilles, walls, barred windows, was designed to keep temptation at bay. And yet, oddly enough, it is precisely that sense of enclosure which seemed to heighten the tension. A curious footnote appears in many visitation records. Officials regularly complained about excessive familiarity among the sisters, which suggests that even without men present, intimacy seeped through. Your mind drifts to the way candlelight bends against carved wood. Behind those screens, friendships flourished. Some were genuine bonds of comfort, while others leaned toward the forbidden. Historians still argue whether these friendships crossed into the sexual or remained in the realm of emotional solace, but the sheer volume of complaints points towards something more than just innocent sisterly affection. You notice how the gap between official silence and whispered rumor is itself almost erotic, full of tension. In your ears, the echo changes into a memory of bells. Picture a nun walking slowly back from Compline, the final prayers of the night. Her fingers brush another's hand in the gloom. The touch is nothing, a slip, perhaps yet inside the rules of enclosure. Such gestures carried immense weight. The tension must have been palpable, the candle flames quivering as though embarrassed witnesses. The convent was a paradox. On one hand, it represented female withdrawal from worldly corruption. On the other, it concentrated women together in ways that medieval society often viewed with suspicion. Scholars bicker over whether outside rumors exaggerated what truly went on, or whether church authorities willfully suppressed known practices to avoid scandal. The lack of clarity leaves you suspended between two flickering possibilities: piety or passion. For a moment, it feels as though you're standing in one of those corridors, the wax smoke in your nose, the cool stone against your palm, and you sense that behind every door a secret might be waiting. The candles burn down slowly, just as the centuries have burned away certainty. But the stories remain, whispering that convent life was not purely angelic, and so you drift deeper into the tale, carrying the soft glow of those cloisters with you, wondering how far the shadows will reach. Your thoughts drift from the dim cloisters into the quieter cells where the wooden walls are thin and the hours long. A convent promised order, but inside that order lived bodies with warmth and need. Imagine yourself lying on a straw pallet, rough wool against your skin, the smell of tallow smoke still lingering from the chapel lamps. In the darkness you hear a soft rustle, just the adjustment of a veil, or perhaps someone moving closer than rules allowed. Records confirm that many convent rules explicitly forbade what they called particular friendships. A 13th century Cistercian statute warned against nuns forming exclusive bonds with one another, fearing it would distract them from prayer. And yet, oddly enough, those rules appear so often in documents that you begin to suspect they were broken regularly. Why keep repeating a command if it weren't constantly ignored? Your mind drifts to one scandalous aside preserved in visitation records. An abbot reporting that two sisters were inseparable in their embraces, a phrase so deliberately vague that it leaves much to the imagination. Were they hugging like sisters, or locked in something far less innocent? The record does not say, but its tone suggests more than simple comfort. Scholars still argue whether convent authorities exaggerated such cases to maintain control, or whether they quietly tolerated bonds so long as they did not spill into public scandal. Some argue the Church used the language of sin as a catch, all for any form of closeness, even gestures we might today consider harmless. Others claim that the wording was a deliberate cloak for more physical acts. The arguments split along the lines of how much we trust the clerical voice to tell the truth. Picture two women in that cell, one reaching out in the silence, fingertips brushing a sleeve, the other freezing at first, then relaxing into the contact. To them, it might have felt like rebellion wrapped in tenderness. The timber walls absorbed the sound, the night hid the blush, and desire disguised itself as consolation. A council decree proves that even visiting confessors worried about touch among sisters. Priests who heard confessions often warned superiors of the dangers of too much familiarity. Yet the warnings never stopped. The cycle of rule, break, and repeat tells you everything you need to know about human nature behind locked doors. For a moment, it feels as though the wooden boards beneath your hand are vibrating with centuries of secrets. The cold drafts in the corridor carry the scent of herbs from the garden lavender, sage, rosemary once thought to soothe the body, but perhaps also masking the pulse of hidden encounters. What strikes you most is not whether every rumor is true, but the fact that they existed at all. If medieval nuns were the very picture of restraint, why did so many whispers rise around them? You picture again the fleeting touch of a hand in darkness, and you sense that behind each warning scroll or church decree lies a real woman who longed, reached, and found comfort in another. And so you drift deeper, the cloister's silence wrapping you like a blanket, while the faint sound of sandals on stone fades into the memory of hands brushing where no one was supposed to notice. The echo of footsteps leads you now toward the wooden lattice of a confessional, that cramped booth where words were meant to cleanse but sometimes stirred desires instead. Imagine the smell of polish on oak, the faint squeak of hinges, the stale breath of incense hanging around like an invisible shroud. You kneel, the wood biting into your knees, and through the screen comes a whisper, a priest's voice steady, low, almost conspiratorial. Records confirm that the confessional as we picture it today, little boxes with latticed windows, did not become common until the early modern era. In the Middle Ages, confession often happened face to face, sometimes even in corners of a chapel. That intimacy alone could blur lines. A council decree from the 13th century warned clergy against too close familiarity with nuns under their care, which is a polite way of saying temptation was already on everyone's mind. Oddly enough, the confessional itself became both a safeguard and a stage for risky encounters. One scandalous aside, preserved in visitation notes, mentions a friar who lingered so long with one particular nun that others joked he was hearing confessions of the body rather than the soul. The choice of words hints at something much less spiritual than intended. Scholars bicker over whether such reports were exaggerated to tarnish the reputation of rival orders, or whether the secrecy of the confessional made it the perfect cover for liaisons. No agreement has been reached on whether these rumors reflected widespread practice or isolated lapses, but the sheer persistence of the theme across Europe suggests more than idle slander. For a moment, it feels as though you are that nun, whispering through the screen. Each word about sins of thought or desire is itself laced with suggestion. The priest responds with guidance, but his tone, gentle, persuasive, carries undertones you cannot quite dismiss. The boundary between spiritual father and human man blurs with every sigh. In your ears, the sound of breath becomes louder than the words. You picture fingers brushing the lattice, wood separating skin from skin by only an inch. The closeness, the secrecy, the very posture of kneeling all combine to turn ritual into something charged. One curious footnote in a Dominican record even claimed that some confessors deliberately imposed penances that involved physical closeness. Long embraces, shared tears, whispered prayers pressed cheek to cheek. It is impossible to know how literal or metaphorical such accounts were, yet their presence in official complaints proves the fear was real. Arguments split along another line too. Were nuns victims of predatory priests? Or were some equally complicit in seeking comfort that official vows denied? Historians still argue whether the confessional was more often a tool of control or a space where women could negotiate tiny fragments of intimacy in a world that offered them none. The image lingers, a nun leaving the confessional with cheeks flushed, the smell of candle smoke in her veil, uncertain whether she had been absolved or entangled. And you, listening centuries later, feel the weight of those whispered words curling through the silence like smoke, unable to fade completely. Your mind drifts deeper into the convent chapel, where shadows lean long against stone walls and the smell of beeswax mixes with cold incense. Tonight you witness not the strict posture of prayer, but the trembling intensity of visions, a realm where devotion often slid into the sensual. You imagine kneeling in the dim light, hearing a sister gasp as though struck by lightning, though her eyes are closed and her lips whisper not a word anyone can quite understand. Surviving chronicles note that some nuns reported raptures so vivid they were taken as signs of sanctity. The mystic Angela of Foligno, for instance, described encounters with Christ so overwhelming that her body melted like wax in longing. The language was drenched in passion, and clerical scribes struggled to decide whether it was holy or dangerously suggestive. Oddly enough, one scandalous aside reveals that some sisters described their experiences in terms of bodily union, Christ entering their hearts, piercing their sides, even filling them with sweetness. These metaphors, clothed in theology, carried an undeniable undertone of physical intimacy. To medieval readers, the overlap between ecstasy and eroticism was both unsettling and strangely magnetic. Scholars still argue whether these accounts were carefully staged by confessors guiding women to describe visions in bridal terms, or whether the women themselves instinctively reached for language of desire when trying to put their trances into words. Arguments split along whether mysticism was a channel for genuine spirituality or a thin veil over forbidden longing. For a moment, it feels as though you are inside the chapel during one of these fits of vision. A nun trembles on the cold flagstones, her veil slipping as she clasps her chest, murmuring of divine union. Others watch in silence, unsure if they witness sainthood or scandal. The candle flames twitch as if embarrassed to illuminate the scene. In your ears, her moans of devotion sound startlingly close to earthly pleasure. The stone columns seem to hum back her voice, each echo thick with suggestion. And you wonder, did the sisters around her feel envy, fear, or an unspoken pull toward the same rapture? A curious footnote lingers from visitation records in Germany. Officials once demanded that mystics tone down descriptions of their marriages with Christ because they distracted others from ordinary prayer. That demand alone hints at how unsettlingly vivid these performances must have been. As you lean into the hush of that chapel, you sense that the border between heaven and desire was far thinner than official rulebooks allowed. Mystical marriage became both a shield and a loophole. What might have been scandal when directed at a human could be excused when directed at the divine, and you feel the weight of that paradox pressing like cool stone against your palm, as the centuries fold back into the trembling silence of a nun's vision. The candles gutter low, and your thoughts wander into the chamber where discipline was supposed to sharpen the soul. The air smells of leather straps and damp stone, and the sound you hear is not chanting, but the sharp crack of a whip followed by a sigh that is difficult to categorize. Was it pain, or something dangerously close to pleasure? Visitation reports detail that penitential flagellation was not unusual among medieval religious communities. Both monks and nuns struck their own bodies, or submitted to being struck, as a way to imitate Christ's suffering. Some communities even scheduled it weekly. The records present it as holy endurance, yet the language describing flushed skin and trembling bodies makes you pause. Oddly enough, one scandalous aside appears in a 15th century account where a superior scolded novices for laughing during group flagellation, noting that their faces reddened and their eyes shone too brightly. The complaint suggests the line between devotion and sensual arousal was noticed, even if not named directly. Scholars still argue whether the erotic undertones were accidental byproducts of ritual or knowingly cultivated within closed convents. Some insist the human body reacts predictably to rhythmic pain and heightened emotion, while others claim chroniclers exaggerated such incidents to discredit women's piety. No agreement has been reached on whether the laughter was nervous, mocking, or something far more subversive. For a moment, it feels as though you are in that dim chamber, hearing the leather whistle through the air, followed by the muffled thud on bare flesh beneath a coarse habit. The participants kneel, faces pressed to the ground, yet the room vibrates with an energy that is not purely penitential. The sound in your ears becomes layered, the slap of the whip, the gasp that follows, the shuffle of bodies repositioning. You wonder if the ritual, intended to subdue the senses, instead awakened them in ways no rulebook anticipated. A curious footnote from a Franciscan manual even warned leaders to guard against the devil's counterfeit sweetness during flagellation, a phrase that implies ecstasy and temptation were not only possible but expected. The Church knew the risk, and yet it kept the practice alive, perhaps unwilling to admit what it stirred. As you drift in the echo of those lashes, the line between penance and pleasure blurs into the smoky air, leaving you to wonder if the convent's strictest rituals were also its most subversive secrets. The faint crack of the whip fades, and your mind slides toward the objects scattered around the convent chapel, items meant for prayer, yet capable of entirely different uses when imagination took over. The scent of wax still hangs thick, mingling with the tang of iron from candle stands. You picture a rosary, smooth beads warmed by constant touch, lying coiled like a secret on a wooden bench. Contemporary accounts describe how devotional objects became extensions of the body, intimate companions in both prayer and daily routine. A crucifix pressed to the lips, a relic clasped against the chest, or beads passed slowly through fingers, each was supposed to anchor devotion. But in private moments, the line between spiritual comfort and sensual use could blur. Oddly enough, a curious footnote emerges from a visitation in Cologne, where officials complained that nuns handled their beads with levity and laughter. The wording is strange. Laughter alone is no crime. So perhaps the complaint disguised behavior they dared not write plainly. Beads, after all, could be drawn along skin as easily as through hands in prayer. Scholars bicker over whether such accusations reflected genuine misuse or merely suspicion from outsiders who saw intimacy where none existed. Some argue these objects were too familiar, too tactile, not to invite wandering thoughts. Others maintain that clerical watchdogs projected their own fears, imagining sins that were never there. For a moment, it feels as though you are kneeling with the rosary in your palm, the polished wood warm from use. Your fingers hesitate at each bead, not from piety, but from the strange pull of repetition. You close your eyes, and the cool brass of the crucifix against your lips sends a shiver that has little to do with doctrine. A council decree proves that relics in particular were to be kept locked away lest improper handling occur. The warning itself suggests how tempting proximity to sacred objects could become. Imagine a reliquary, jeweled and glimmering in candlelight, kissed again and again, until reverence and desire became indistinguishable. One scandalous aside appears in a hagiography where a nun claimed to feel Christ's body press upon her, through a crucifix she embraced in prayer. Whether metaphor or not, the image is undeniably suggestive. The scribe recorded it as holy, but you hear the undertones echoing through the centuries. The chapel is hushed, only the sound of beads clicking faintly, and you realize how easily the sacred could slip into the profane simply by lingering too long in the touch of polished wood, in the press of metal, in the imagination of those cloistered from every other intimacy. The beads fade back into the shadows, and your mind drifts towards something even stranger, the way hunger itself was tangled with desire inside the cloister. The convent kitchen smells of boiled cabbage and coarse bread, yet there were times when the smell was absent, when plates stayed empty by choice or command. What should have been holy fasting sometimes sparked sensations the nuns themselves struggled to name. Archival evidence suggests that medieval mystics often connected physical hunger with spiritual ecstasy. Catherine of Siena, though not a nun in the strict cloistered sense, starved herself into trances that contemporaries interpreted as holy rapture. In convent settings, similar extremes were praised as sanctity but also whispered about with unease. Oddly enough, one scandalous aside from a Franciscan visitation in the 15th century describes sisters who refused food until they trembled with sweetness. The phrase lingers, strangely sweetness, is not the word you expect for starvation. It hints at bodily responses that mingled pleasure with deprivation. Scholars still argue whether fasting induced a kind of altered state comparable to intoxication, or whether accounts were embroidered by later hagiographers eager to make ordinary discipline look miraculous. Arguments split along the question of whether the nuns experienced authentic visions or simply physiological side effects from lack of nutrition. For a moment, it feels as though you are seated at that bare wooden table, the smell of stale bread hovering just out of reach, your stomach knotted in emptiness. The ache sharpens your awareness of your body, your skin more sensitive, your breath louder, your thoughts drifting toward longings you never speak. Fasting may have been a rule, but its effects carried you somewhere beyond prayer. In your ears, the scrape of an empty bowl across wood becomes almost rhythmic, a sound marking the boundary between denial and indulgence. The very absence of food magnifies every other sensation. The heat of another body near you in the refectory, the smell of herbs in the garden, the memory of sweetness on your tongue. A curious footnote in Dominican writings even warned that prolonged fasting could inflame the senses toward vanity. The choice of word inflame suggests that clerics knew starvation could stir desires rather than quiet them. Hunger and lust, they feared, were closer cousins than anyone wished to admit. So as you drift through the quiet of that convent dining hall, you sense how denial itself became its own strange stimulant. A plate left empty might have promised heaven, but it also awakened the body in ways the rulebook never mentioned. The empty bowls of fasting fade, and now your thoughts settle on something deceptively innocent, the kiss of peace. You hear the murmur of liturgy in the chapel, the sound of sandals shifting against stone, and then silence broken by a soft exchange of breath as lips brush cheeks. This gesture was supposed to symbolize harmony, yet within the tight world of cloistered women, it could take on an intimacy that rules struggled to contain. One preserved statute makes clear that the kiss of peace was a required part of certain liturgical celebrations. It traveled down the choir stalls like a ripple of affection, each sister pressing her lips to the next. In theory, the act was spiritual, representing the bond of Christ's body. But in practice, the repetition of touch in a world starved of other forms of physical affection made it charged in ways perhaps no abbot anticipated. Oddly enough, a curious footnote in a 14th century visitation report from Italy complains of sisters who lingered too long in the kiss, with embraces beyond what was fitting. The inspector's stiff phrasing betrays his discomfort. To him it was scandal. To the women, perhaps, it was simply one moment where warmth slipped past the lattice of rules. Scholars still argue whether the kiss was policed more harshly in nunneries than in monasteries, since male monastics were trusted differently. Arguments split along whether church leaders feared scandal because of genuine excesses, or because they could not bear the thought of women experiencing pleasure without men. The records are thin, yet the concern is constant. For a moment, it feels as though you stand in that choir stall, cool wood beneath your hand, candle smoke clinging to your veil. A sister leans in her breath warm, her lips brushing your cheek. The scent of rosemary from her habit fills your nose, and though it is only a second, the touch lingers like a secret pressed into your skin. In your ears, the whispered prayers merge with the faint smack of lips. You realize how little sound it takes to shift a ritual from solemn to intimate. Each kiss down the line was meant to be uniform, yet each one held possibility too quick, too long, too soft, too insistent. A scandalous aside in monastic correspondence even joked about the kiss spreading affections that lasted well beyond the service. Humour, in this case, was a veil for anxiety. If affection travelled from lips to heart, it could grow into what clerics feared most: relationships with depth and passion. Imagine the rulebook's solution. Some communities replaced the direct kiss with a shared object, a wooden board or pax, kissed in turn to reduce bodily contact. But even here, one council decree proves nuns sometimes still kissed each other instead, ignoring the board as if the substitute could never replace the warmth of real skin. As you drift in that chapel, the kiss of peace becomes less about theology and more about the ache for touch. The stone walls cannot prevent the memory of lips against skin, nor can statutes erase the sweetness of one fleeting second of forbidden closeness. The warmth of that fleeting kiss fades, and your mind wanders to a quieter corner of the convent, the bathhouse. The air here is different, thick with steam, scented faintly of herbs like thyme or mint dropped into the water to mask the stale odour of stone halls. In this space, rules of modesty met the reality of human bodies, uncloaked, vulnerable, and temptingly near. Contemporary accounts describe how many convents were equipped with communal baths, or at least a chamber for washing, since hygiene was essential for health and prayer alike. A Benedictine manual instructed that sisters should bathe in groups, clothed in modest shifts, a rule that shows concern for propriety, but also acknowledges that washing together was unavoidable. Oddly enough, a curious footnote survives from a 15th century inspection of a German convent, where the bishop complained that the sisters laugh and tarry long in the stews. His wording suggests merriment as much as cleansing, and stews was sometimes slang for bathhouses associated with less pious activities. You can almost hear the uncomfortable shuffle of the inspector's boots as he wrote his report. Scholars bicker over whether these complaints hint at genuine impropriety or simply clerical paranoia about unclothed bodies in close proximity. Some argue that laughter itself was considered suspicious, proof that joy in the body could not possibly be innocent. Others suggest that extended bathing did provide a space for quiet rebellion, where the restrictions of veils and habits slipped away with damp cloth. No agreement has been reached on whether convent bathhouses were mundane necessities or hotbeds of forbidden play. For a moment, it feels as though you step inside that steamy room. The air is damp against your skin, droplets running down rough plaster walls. A nun wrings her hair, water trickling over bare arms. Another adjusts her linen shift, clinging damp to her form. The steam blurs outlines, making the scene both hazy and intimate. In your ears, you catch the splash of water, the scrape of a stool, and the low ripple of laughter echoing in a chamber that was supposed to be silent. Each sound hints at ease, at a comfort that bends the stiff expectations of cloister life. A scandalous aside in one convent chronicle even noted that sisters brought perfumes into the bathhouse, an indulgence considered worldly. Yet perhaps the scent of rose oil or lavender was not only for cleansing but also for transforming the bath into something sensual. Inhaling that fragrance, you realize how easily the ordinary act of washing could feel like luxury, or even temptation. So the bathhouse lingers in your imagination, a place where bodies, usually bound by heavy cloth, met water and each other in shared exposure. Whether the laughter was innocent or suggestive, the steam carried away the certainty, leaving behind only echoes of desire rising with the vapours. The steam of the bathhouse disperses, and now your thoughts drift towards something stranger still: blood and milk, two fluids that appeared often in mystical writing and sometimes slipped into convent practice in ways both symbolic and unsettling. You sense the faint coppery tang of blood in the air, mixed with the sweeter scent of warmed milk, as though the chapel itself were holding its breath. Visitation records detail that some nuns engaged in devotion, centered on the wounds of Christ, envisioning themselves drinking from his side or mingling their blood with his. These meditations were officially encouraged as signs of empathy, yet the imagery carried a bodily intimacy difficult to overlook. Strangely, a curious anecdote surfaces in the hagiography of Lutgard of Awiers, who described visions in which Christ nursed her at his breast, filling her mouth with sweetness, like milk. To later readers, the description seemed both maternal and disturbingly erotic, straddling two registers the Church never fully reconciled. Scholars still argue whether such accounts were purely metaphorical, or whether some women attempted to act them out in ritualized form, mixing drops of blood into chalices, or using milk as a symbol of divine nourishment. Arguments split along theological lines. Was this simply mystical poetry, or a sign of unorthodox practices within cloister walls? For a moment, it feels as though you are kneeling before an altar, watching a sister press her lips to a painted wound on a crucifix, her eyes closed in rapture. In another corner, a novice pours goat's milk into a small vessel, whispering words of thanksgiving, as if each drop carried divine significance. In your ears you catch the soft clink of pottery, the drip of liquid into a cup, and the faint hiss of a candle's wick. The atmosphere is charged, almost too physical for what was supposed to be spiritual devotion. One eyebrow raising aside comes from a medical manuscript, where a monk physician noted with disapproval that nuns sometimes mixed their own blood into herbal concoctions, claiming it made the remedy more sacred. Whether fact or rumor, the note suggests that bodily fluids had blurred into symbols of power and closeness to the divine. As you linger in that chapel, the image of blood and milk intertwining becomes a metaphor for the impossible balance the convent sought. Purity proclaimed, yet desire slipping through in the most physical ways imaginable. The strange mingling of blood and milk fades into the background, and now your thoughts drift toward an altogether different performance, the mystical marriages enacted inside convent walls. Imagine the dimly lit chapel late at night, candles arranged not in the neat rows of liturgy, but in a circle around one trembling figure. The air smells faintly of lavender wax, mingled with the musk of damp stone. The sisters kneel in silence as one of their own dons a bridal crown of flowers and prepares to wed the heavenly bridegroom. Contemporary chronicles describe how nuns, officially called brides of Christ, often took the title with unsettling literalness. During their profession ceremonies, they wore wedding gowns, rings were slipped onto their fingers, and hymns described them entering a union as binding as any earthly marriage. For many, this was simply ritual, but in certain convents, the symbolism spilled over into something far more sensuous. One unusual account, tucked away in a 15th century French visitation, tells of a prioress who arranged nightly reenactments of her mystical marriage. She insisted on dressing in white, wearing garlands, and lying prostrate before the altar as she recited love poetry addressed to Christ. The witnesses were uneasy, noting the excessive passion in her words. What unsettled the inspectors most was not her theology, but the almost erotic intensity with which she performed it. Scholars remain divided on how to interpret such ceremonies. Some argue that the language of bridal mysticism was so common that we should not read too much into its sensual tone. Others point out that in a world where women had almost no sanctioned outlet for desire, the ritual of divine marriage became a stage on which suppressed longings played out. There is no agreement on whether the passion was primarily spiritual or whether it carried a bodily thrill. For a moment, it feels as though you are watching one of these ceremonies unfold. A sister kneels at the altar, her hands clasped but trembling. She whispers vows not to a man in flesh but to an unseen bridegroom. The candle flames stretch toward her veil, as if drawn in by her fervor. Around her, the other women bow their heads, but you sense that they too are caught in the intensity of her performance. The air grows thick, heavy, with a longing that cannot be named aloud. You notice details that blur the line between marriage and mysticism. The ring placed on the finger feels warm, as though it carried more than symbolic weight. The crown of flowers slips slightly, petals brushing against the nun's flushed cheeks. The silence that follows each vow is filled with unspoken questions. What kind of marriage is this? And what desires does it secretly sanctify? A curious aside survives from the writings of Saint Teresa of Avila, centuries later, in which she recounts a vision of an angel piercing her heart with a golden spear, leaving her aflame with divine love. Bernini's famous sculpture captures the moment with unmistakable sensuality. Though Teresa was not a medieval nun, her language reflects a long tradition of mystical unions, where physical metaphors became too vivid to dismiss as merely poetic. The scholarly debate stretches further. Were such experiences spontaneous, or carefully nurtured by confessors who coached the women into using nuptial imagery? Some claim that male clerics projected their own fantasies onto the visions of nuns, recording them with deliberate sensuality. Others argue the women themselves found empowerment in describing their spiritual lives with the language of passion, seizing control of an identity otherwise denied to them. You imagine the cloister garden the morning after one of these ceremonies. Dew clings to the herbs, the air crisp, and yet the women walking among the rows of sage and mint carry themselves differently, eyes brighter, movements softer. Something has been released, not confessed, but shared in silence. The mystical marriage leaves traces not only in the chapel but in the subtle intimacy of daily life. In your ears, the echoes of hymns still linger. The words, "Bride of Christ, chosen and beloved," sound tender, but under the hush of candle smoke they take on another dimension. You realize how easy it would have been for a lonely woman in a walled convent to let those words become more than liturgical formula, to hear in them the promise of touch, closeness, even consummation. One eyebrow-raising report from a Benedictine convent in England mentions a novice who grew so entranced by her mystical marriage ritual that she refused to speak to anyone for days, claiming she was with her spouse. Inspectors found her behavior troubling, but strangely could not fault her, since she remained within the language of devotion. The record ends with the vague note, "Her ardor must be tempered." You sense the frustration of men who wish to control passion, yet could not forbid it when it was cloaked in sanctity. As the candle flames gutter low in your imagination, you feel how fragile the boundary truly was. Mystical marriage may have been a rite of devotion, but it also became an arena where desire, ritual, and imagination met. Each vow whispered in the chapel reverberated as both prayer and passion, leaving the cloister walls vibrating with secrets they could never quite contain. The image of the bridal crown wilts in your mind, and you find yourself instead staring at a sheet of parchment, stained with ink and creased from too many hands. Convents were not only places of prayer but also centers of writing, and tucked among the psalters and devotional treatises were letters, fragments of passion wrapped in pious disguise. The quiet scratching of a quill on parchment fills your imagination, the smell of iron gall ink stinging faintly in your nose. Monastic statutes confirm that nuns were permitted to write letters only under strict supervision. In theory, all correspondence was to be dictated to or at least approved by a superior. Yet in practice, women found ways to write secretly, slipping their notes through servants, lay sisters, or even sympathetic confessors. That these rules had to be repeated in synods suggests how often they were ignored. What catches your attention is a set of preserved scraps from the 15th century, discovered in a convent archive in Belgium. They read like devotional verses but carry an unmistakable undertone of intimacy. "Your face shines brighter to me than any relic," one line declares. Another promises, "I will carry your name upon my lips when I kneel in prayer." These words could be about Christ, but they could also be about a woman writing to another woman. Ambiguity, after all, was the perfect cloak. Historians divide sharply on whether such letters are examples of spiritual friendship or evidence of clandestine romance. Some argue that the language of devotion was simply the shared vocabulary of the time, used freely without erotic intent. Others suggest that in communities where women were forbidden any other kind of intimacy, passionate friendship easily blurred into physical longing. No agreement has been reached on how to draw the line. For a moment, it feels as though you are bent over that parchment by candlelight. Your hand cramps as you try to disguise your words in layers of biblical metaphor. You know the danger if caught. Your letter could be burned and you punished. And yet the risk heightens the thrill. You dip the quill again, your pulse quickening as each word grows more daring. The sound in your ears is no longer just the scratching of ink, but the heartbeat of secrecy itself. You fold the page, seal it with wax, and pray that your confidant will receive it without interception. The wax cools quickly, brittle under your thumb, as though ready to break at the slightest touch. One scandalous anecdote comes from an English visitation record, in which inspectors confiscated letters of unsuitable familiarity exchanged between two choir nuns. The report refuses to print the words, but condemns them as inflamed with passion. The mere fact of their survival hints at a depth of feeling that officials could not ignore, yet also could not expose in full detail. And then there is the role of code. In some convents, women developed symbols, flowers drawn in margins, verses marked with tiny crosses, even the deliberate omission of vowels to disguise affection in plain sight. To outsiders, it looked like sloppy handwriting or ordinary decoration, but to the intended reader, it was unmistakably intimate. This practice, rarely acknowledged in official records, survives in hints and fragments, enough to tantalize without ever giving certainty. You imagine the moment of delivery. A lay sister enters with a basket of laundry or a jug of water. Tucked beneath the cloth is a folded slip. Hands brush briefly as the exchange occurs, just a flicker of touch, but enough to quicken the pulse. The note is later unwrapped in the solitude of a cell, read by moonlight filtering through a narrow slit of window. Every word glows with double meaning. Scholars bicker over whether these written exchanges were more dangerous than whispered conversations, since parchment preserved what memory might have forgotten. Some argue that nuns courted peril knowingly, valuing the permanence of ink as proof of their passion. Others believe the very act of writing gave them power control over their narrative in a world where their voices were often silenced. A curious marginal note in one psalter illustrates the tension. Next to a psalm about divine love, a nun scribbled, "His eyes burn as fire, but yours I see each day." It's a line so brief it could almost be overlooked, yet it breaks the frame of devotion and slips into the realm of personal desire. Was it written for another nun? For a priest? Or simply to herself? No one knows, but the ambiguity itself makes it haunting. The chapel bells toll in your imagination, signaling, "Compline." The letters must be hidden quickly, slipped back beneath a mattress or wedged into a crack in the wall. You hear the shuffle of feet returning to cells, the extinguishing of candles, and you realize how many words were smuggled through the darkness of convent nights. Letters, fragile as they were, carried the weight of secret lives. They show you that desire in the convent was not only bodily but also intellectual, written and encoded in metaphors of light, relics, and prayer. They were both confessions and rebellions, and though most were burned or lost, the few that remain flicker across the centuries like embers refusing to die. The rustle of hidden parchment fades from your mind, and suddenly you catch the scent of something older, earthier smoke from herbs, faint traces of ash scattered in the cloister garden. Here the atmosphere changes, for beneath the carefully ordered rows of mint and sage, echoes of ancient beliefs lingered. Though the convent was a Christian stronghold, whispers of pagan fertility rites still seeped into daily practice, twisting old customs into the fabric of cloistered life. Chroniclers note that many convent gardens were planted not only with medicinal herbs, but also with plants long associated with pre-Christian rituals. Mugwort, fennel, and rue were all said to carry protective powers, and their presence in cloisters was justified as medicinal. Yet curiously, some records complain that sisters gathered these herbs by moonlight rather than daylight, muttering words that sounded less like Latin psalms and more like charms. One unusual story comes from a visitation in the Low Countries, where a bishop reprimanded nuns for leaping in circles during the feast of St. John. On the surface, it was a midsummer festival, but the description of dancing around fire recalls pre-Christian fertility celebrations. The inspector dismissed it as levity unsuited to holy women, yet his irritation suggests that the practice was widespread. Scholars remain divided on whether these were deliberate survivals of pagan ritual or simply cultural habits too ingrained to vanish. Some claim the sisters were consciously reviving fertility practices for their own subversive amusement. Others argue these events were community celebrations that blurred the boundary between sacred and profane. No agreement has been reached on whether medieval convents were truly sites of syncretism or merely scapegoated by suspicious clergy. For a moment, it feels as though you are in that convent garden on Midsummer Night. The air is thick with the scent of rosemary and smoke, the ground warm from the bonfire still glowing in the center. Barefoot sisters circle, their white veils catching sparks like fireflies. Laughter ripples through the night, a sound both innocent and daring. The rhythm of sandals against earth becomes a pulse in your ears. You hear the rush of wind as arms stretch skyward, the hiss of sparks leaping into the darkness. What begins as prayerful song drifts into something looser, a chant whose cadences echo much older rhythms. The night conceals faces but magnifies bodies moving close, shoulders brushing, hands clasping, skirts swishing. A peculiar aside survives in a medical treatise, where a physician criticized nuns for burning herbs to stir the blood. He meant it as an accusation of superstition, but his phrase suggests that these rituals were not just symbolic, they were bodily, visceral, tied to pulses quickening beneath linen habits. Consider, too, the symbolism of fertility that lingered in everyday convent life. Bread baked in certain shapes, wreaths woven from ivy, or eggs dyed red for Easter all carried echoes of older rituals. When practiced inside cloister walls, they became safe unless they slipped too far toward the sensual. Inspectors grew anxious not because the women gardened or danced, but because they did so with an intensity that hinted at desire. Scholars debate whether these practices were merely tolerated distractions or intentional acts of rebellion. Some interpret them as coded ways for women to celebrate the body in a culture that demanded its denial. Others think the clergy exaggerated to justify tighter control. Arguments split, as they always do, along the line of how much trust we give to the official voice. You picture a novice plucking mugwort in the moonlight, her fingers smelling of bitterness as she presses the sprigs into her bodice for safekeeping. Another sister whispers words she half remembers from childhood, charms taught by mothers who never fully abandoned old traditions. To them, the garden is not only for medicine but also for secrets. In your ears, the rustling leaves almost sound like voices. The night breeze carries whispers of rituals long past, yet revived in laughter, in song, in the unspoken thrill of gathering together under forbidden skies. You sense that behind the cloister's rigid facade lay a world in which pagan echoes survived, bending the meaning of chastity into something stranger. An especially telling report from a Tuscan convent complains that sisters carved small figurines from wax during harvest festivals. Officially, they were votive offerings, but the inspector wrote, with some alarm, that the figures were handled with too much fondness. His vagueness is deliberate, yet you can almost see the scene: candles burning, shadows flickering on walls, wax softening beneath warm fingers. The persistence of these rites suggests that desire found expression not only in hidden embraces or secret letters, but also in rituals that borrowed from the deep past. For these women, forbidden longings could be disguised as ancient customs, draped in the legitimacy of tradition, even as they broke the rules of enclosure. And so, the convent garden remains in your imagination, fragrant, smoky, alive with half-forgotten songs. Here, pagan echoes wove themselves into the rhythm of prayer, and the result was not purity or rebellion alone, but a tangled mixture that left even the most watchful inspectors unsure of what they had witnessed. The smoke of midsummer bonfires lingers in your imagination, but now your steps carry you back inside the cloister, toward a chamber that smells of ointments, dried herbs, and bitter wine. The convent infirmary was meant to heal bodies, yet it also offered a space where touch, medicine, and secrecy could merge. In the faint lamplight, you picture shelves lined with jars, camphor, sage, powdered roots, each label promising remedy but also carrying the possibility of misuse. Monastic inventories reveal that nuns were often trained as healers. They compounded salves, distilled tinctures, and applied poultices, tending both their sisters and outsiders who sought aid. Many were skilled midwives, called upon for difficult births. Their medical knowledge gave them authority rare for women of the period, though it also brought suspicion. Male clergy worried that intimate contact between healer and patient could easily slide into impropriety. An unusual record surfaces from a 14th-century German visitation. Inspectors noted with dismay that ointments were being applied with undue familiarity, hinting at more than clinical care. The words are cautious, but their very vagueness invites speculation. Did treatments become occasions for lingering touch? Did the line between nurse and confidant blur into something else? Historians dispute whether such accusations reflect genuine incidents or whether they stem from male unease at women exercising control over medicine. Some argue that the convent infirmary became a covert site for intimacy precisely because the body was already exposed in vulnerability. Others maintain the charges were slanderous, part of a broader campaign to curb women's authority in healing. No consensus has been reached, and the ambiguity itself leaves a haunting trace. For a moment, it feels as though you are seated on the infirmary bench. The wooden surface is cool beneath you, your arm extended as another sister rubs salve into your skin. The ointment smells sharp, like rosemary and vinegar. Her fingers work deliberately, perhaps too slowly. The sensation is medicinal, yes, but also undeniably human. You hold your breath, wondering if she notices your quickened pulse. In your ears, the soft grinding of pestles against mortars mixes with low murmurs of prayer. The rhythm of crushing herbs, steady and repetitive, becomes hypnotic. It feels almost like a heartbeat, a pulse shared between healer and healed. A curious note survives from a 15th-century herbal compiled by a Cistercian nun. In its margins she wrote, "To soothe the fevered body, lay on hands with gentle pressure, for warmth brings comfort to both." The phrasing is innocent, yet you sense the double meaning. Healing touch could comfort the patient, but also the healer herself. There were more secretive practices as well. Some convents prepared potions meant to calm desire, using bitter herbs like rue or wormwood. Ironically, these very substances were also known in folk medicine as abortifacients, linking them directly to the body's most intimate functions. One scandalous report from France accused a group of nuns of tampering with the courses of nature, a phrase often interpreted as attempts at contraception or termination. Whether true or not, the association bound convent medicine forever, with suspicion of hidden sexual knowledge. Scholars bicker about whether these accusations reveal fear of female autonomy or evidence of real experiments. Some point to the fact that nuns had practical access to bodies, herbs, and privacy, making it plausible they explored remedies in ways the Church disapproved. Others argue the claims were exaggerated, designed to discredit communities that defied male oversight. The debate remains unsettled, its ambiguity thick as incense. Picture a novice sneaking into the infirmary at night. She grinds herbs with trembling hands, the smell pungent in the still air. She stirs in drops of wine, then presses the mixture to her lips, tasting bitterness that burns her tongue. Was she treating a fever or experimenting with sensations she could not otherwise explore? The lamp flickers low. Shadows stretch across the stone floor, and you realize that within these medical practices lay both care and temptation. Healing was holy, but touch could not always be controlled. Desire hid itself in ointments and herbs, disguised as duty, yet alive beneath every movement of the hand. And so, the infirmary lingers in your mind, a chamber of medicine and mystery, where the scent of rosemary masks something deeper, and where the promise of healing often mingled with the thrill of forbidden closeness. The fragrance of rosemary from the infirmary fades, and now your thoughts wander towards something more sinister, the stories of possession that haunted convent chronicles. You imagine the chapel lit by a handful of sputtering candles, shadows twitching across the walls, and in the center a sister writhing on the cold flagstones. The air is thick with fear, but also with fascination, as voices whisper that she is not herself. Surviving chronicles note that accusations of demonic possession in convents were remarkably common. In some cases, entire communities were described as seized by fits, the women screaming, fainting, or convulsing together. Clerics wrote these events as proof of spiritual warfare, but the descriptions often read like accounts of overwhelming desire framed as external invasion. When women's bodies moved with abandon, when their cries echoed through the cloister, it was safer to blame a demon than to admit the possibility of lust. An especially striking case comes from the French convent of Loudun in the 17th century, though medieval precedents abound. There, nuns were said to howl obscenities and make indecent gestures under demonic influence. Earlier records mention similar behaviors, sisters speaking in strange voices, tearing their clothes, or collapsing after fits of trembling. Whether genuine or exaggerated, the overlap with the language of sexual scandal is hard to ignore. Scholars continue to debate whether these possessions were psychosomatic, collective hysteria, or conscious acts of rebellion. Some argue the women used possession as a cover, allowing them to express forbidden desires without being blamed personally. Others insist that clerics invented or magnified the stories to explain away behavior that looked too much like passion. Arguments split along disciplinary lines. Psychology, theology, and history each read the same events differently. For a moment, it feels as though you are standing at the edge of that chapel, your back pressed against the wall, heart racing as you watch a nun thrash before the altar. Her veil slips, her hair tumbles loose, her voice rises in a low moan that sounds disturbingly like pleasure. Another sister clasps her tightly, holding her down while murmuring prayers, and you cannot tell whether the embrace restrains or comforts. The sound in your ears is chaotic. The crackle of candles, the murmur of exorcism prayers, the high-pitched wails of women half terrified, half thrilled. The air smells of singed cloth and sweat, an atmosphere heavy with intensity. What should have been a battle with evil feels instead like an eruption of all the emotions that the cloister tried to suppress. One curious note in a Dominican chronicle tells of a nun who, after her supposed possession ended, declared that she had felt a fire in her loins that no water could quench. The chronicler quickly dismissed it as a devil's trick, yet the phrasing lingers. Was it lust disguised as a demon, or a demon described in the language of lust? You picture the exorcist arriving, holy water splashing across the stone floor. The women cry out louder as the prayers intensify. In some accounts, the afflicted fall suddenly limp, sweat shining on their skin, eyes glazed with relief. The onlookers, too, seem altered, as if the spectacle gave them permission to release emotions otherwise forbidden. Scholars bicker over whether such possessions were contagious performances, spreading through suggestion, or whether they were staged by church authorities themselves to reinforce control. Some see them as the only socially acceptable outlet for suppressed female sexuality, while others regard them as clerical slander against women who resisted authority. No single interpretation satisfies. As you let the scene fade, you realize that the language of possession offered a loophole. It allowed women to express movements, cries, and desires that their vows forbade, while assigning blame to an external force. The convent could return to calm afterward, but the memory of writhing bodies and whispered moans lingered too vividly to vanish completely. And so, possession becomes not only a tale of demons, but also a mirror of desire. It reveals how the cloister tried to contain passion, yet in moments of frenzy, the body itself betrayed the secrets that the mind could not confess. The echoes of exorcism chants fade into silence, and your steps wander to another kind of disguise, fabric, cut, and form. In the convent world, identity was defined by habit and veil, markers of obedience. But sometimes, behind locked doors, garments were not what they seemed. Cross-dressing within nunneries carried both playful secrecy and scandalous potential, an unsettling experiment with gender and desire. Contemporary accounts describe strict rules regarding monastic dress. Every nun's veil, wimple, and habit signified humility. Yet visitation reports from Italy and France occasionally mention irregular attire, phrases that hint at women wearing men's tunics, cloaks, or even clerical robes. Inspectors recorded these incidents with unease, their vague language betraying how difficult it was to categorize such behavior. One scandalous detail emerges from the chronicle of a Burgundian convent, where several sisters were caught wearing breeches under their habits for convenience. The word convenience is telling, perhaps it was practical, but rumors swirled that these garments were worn during nocturnal escapades in the cloister gardens. The chronicler left the sentence unfinished, as though unwilling to print more. Historians remain divided on why cross-dressing appeared in convent records. Some argue it was purely practical, a matter of warmth or protection. Others suggest it was symbolic, an experiment in assuming male roles, perhaps even slipping into the power associated with masculinity. Still others interpret it as a cover for clandestine encounters, allowing sisters to blur boundaries in both appearance and intimacy. No consensus has been reached, and the ambiguity leaves the reader unsettled. For a moment, it feels as though you are inside a dim dormitory at midnight. A sister loosens the cords of her habit and, with laughter too loud for silence, pulls on a man's tunic borrowed from a servant. She ties a belt tight at her waist and struts across the room. Others giggle, veils half slipping, while one woman looks longer than she should, her gaze fixed not on the joke but on the transformation itself. In your ears, the sound of cloth rustling becomes strangely charged. The swish of fabric across stone, the thud of boots worn for play acting, the squeak of a leather belt buckle, all of it breaks the monotony of daily dress. The air smells of sweat and lamp smoke, the sharp contrast of garments never meant for female skin. An eyebrow-raising aside comes from a late medieval penitential manual warning confesses that, if women don male attire in jest, discipline must be applied, lest pride and corruption follow. The admonition is harsh for what might have been a game, suggesting the clerics sensed something more dangerous, the potential for attraction ignited by costume. Scholars bicker over whether such acts were tolerated within the sisterhood as harmless amusement or condemned as breaches of chastity. Some note that in medieval plays performed by nuns, cross-dressing roles were common, sanctioned as edifying allegory. But when the same garments appeared off-stage, unease grew. The argument split between seeing these moments as theatrical play or as genuine erotic experimentation. Imagine, too, the possibility of confession following one of these nights. A nun kneels before her confessor, admitting with downcast eyes that she had dressed improperly. He might scold her, or he might linger on the details, imagination stirred by the blurred lines of gender. The sin becomes both rebuke and fantasy, a secret now shared between penitent and priest. But the practice did not always remain playful. A record from Spain mentions a runaway nun disguised as a young man, traveling with a pilgrim band for months before being discovered. Her disguise had fooled both men and women alike, leading to whispered speculation about what she experienced in freedom. To contemporaries, her story was scandal. To us, it hints at a profound desire to break out of constraints and live in another skin. In your imagination, the cloister garden at dusk becomes a stage. Women slip into tunics, fasten belts, and act out mock sermons or knightly gestures. Laughter erupts, but beneath it runs a current of curiosity. How does it feel to be someone else, to step outside of assigned roles, even for an hour? Perhaps the thrill was less about costume and more about possibility. A curious note in a convent account book even records the purchase of tailor's cloth for disguises. The entry sits awkwardly between mundane expenses for bread and candles. What were these disguises for? A saint's play? A private ritual? Or something unrecorded, hidden forever in the silence of stone walls? The thought lingers as you drift deeper into the cloister's silence. Clothes define identity, yet they also invite play, rebellion, and desire. Within convent walls, cross-dressing became more than fabric. It became a way of reaching beyond boundaries, of embodying longings that rules tried to smother. And so the swish of a tunic, the gleam of a borrowed belt buckle, and the echo of laughter in the dormitory remind you that even in the strictest cloisters, identity was never fixed. It was mutable, dangerous, and strangely liberating, carrying within it the possibility of both scandal and freedom. The image of a sister strutting in borrowed breeches fades, and now you drift toward a darker corridor, one where silence feels heavier than stone. Midnight in the convent is not empty. It hums with secrets. Imagine the chapel long after compline has ended, candles snuffed until only the faint glow of embers remains, and footsteps slide across the flagstones with a care that suggests not prayer but something forbidden. Manuscript inventories remind us that cloisters were never entirely still at night. Rules required watchful porters and rotating night vigils, yet inspection notes occasionally mention sisters wandering after hours. The wording is vague, but it hints that the quiet corridors often held meetings not on the official timetable. One eccentric report from a 15th century visitation in northern France describes nuns gathering in the chapel, with gestures unseemly and embraces prolonged. The inspector refused to give detail, but his discomfort is plain. To him, the gathering was disorderly. To the women involved, it may have been the only chance for closeness without supervision. Historians disagree sharply on how to read such nocturnal scenes. Some see them as slander, crafted to undermine women's authority. Others believe these complaints preserve echoes of real encounters, moments when convent walls, meant to enforce purity, instead created opportunities for secrecy. Interpretations remain divided. Was midnight simply a metaphor for temptation, or a practical cover for bodies meeting in the dark? For a moment, it feels as though you are standing just inside the chapel doors. The air is damp with smoke from extinguished tapers, the faint aroma of wax still clinging to stone. You hear whispers too soft to make out, then the sudden intake of breath as two silhouettes come together in the half-light. The marble of the altar gleams faintly, an unwitting witness. The sounds sharpen in your ears, the scrape of a bench moving, the rustle of cloth, the muffled laugh quickly hushed. Every small noise is magnified by the cavernous chapel, yet no one outside hears a thing. Desire, hidden by day, unfurls cautiously here beneath the vaulted ceiling. A curious marginal note in a devotional text hints at this atmosphere. Scribbled by a nun beside the Latin words for vigil, she added, and the night is long, but sweet in company. Whether she referred to divine presence or human companionship, the ambiguity lingers. Some scholars suggest that midnight vigils themselves encouraged intimacy. The fatigue, the hush, the flickering light, all conditions that blurred focus, lowering barriers. Others counter that these accusations reflect clerical unease with women awake while men slept. Either way, the chapel at midnight became a charged space, filled with both devotion and potential scandal. You picture the moment of dispersal. Sandals slide quickly across stone as sisters hurry back to cells before the bell rings. Candles are relit in corners, disguising the traces of what has passed. To outsiders, nothing happened. To those within, the memory glows like ember beneath ash. And so, midnight in the convent is never empty. It is a time when discipline loosens, when whispered laughter echoes against ancient stone, and when the silence itself seems to tremble with the weight of secrets too dangerous to confess. The echo of midnight footsteps fades, and now your thoughts drift toward stories whispered far beyond cloister walls. Convents were not sealed from politics. Many were filled with daughters of noble families, women placed behind stone for reasons of inheritance, scandal, or diplomacy. With their names still echoing in courts, rumors about their lives became fodder for royal gossip. The cloister might have been locked, but tongues outside were anything but silent. Contemporary chronicles attest that kings and dukes often used convents to house daughters who were inconvenient to marry or too politically sensitive to remain at court. These noble nuns lived with privileges their poorer sisters did not: personal servants, private cells, and access to luxuries like imported fabrics or sweetmeats. Inspectors frequently scolded them for excess, noting silks hidden beneath habits or rings worn in secret. An intriguing anecdote comes from the English court of Edward II. Chroniclers recorded that several aristocratic women placed in convents were notorious for entertaining visitors behind grilles, conversations laced with laughter that made bishops uneasy. Though never proven, the persistence of such rumors shows how easily noble birth transformed into scandalous suspicion once confined. Researchers cannot settle whether these tales were rooted in fact or jealousy. Some argue that noblewomen had greater means to bribe guards and obtain privacy, making transgression more likely. Others suggest that their very status made them targets for rumor, since scandal about a princess turned nun carried political weight. Interpretations remain split between viewing these stories as slander and treating them as evidence of real intrigue. For a moment, it feels as though you are listening at the grill yourself. A richly veiled sister leans close, her words soft but laced with humor, while on the other side a courtier chuckles nervously, aware of the risk. The smell of perfume, out of place in the cloister, drifts faintly into the air. Around them silence holds, but it feels like a silence filled with complicity. In your ears, the sound of jewelry clinking beneath linen is louder than any psalm. The swish of silk hidden under wool, the faint pop of candied fruit being chewed, all of it betrays the presence of wealth. And with wealth comes attention, not all of it welcome. A curious notation from a Burgundian visitation records that one abbess entertained noble guests with dancing. The report tries to soften the detail, framing it as cultural enrichment, yet you sense the discomfort of the clerics writing it down. To them, dancing was a slippery slope toward disorder. To the nuns, it might have been an echo of the courtly life they had lost, or a deliberate reminder that they were not wholly contained by vows. Historians diverge on whether these noble convents should be seen as prisons or gilded retreats. Some highlight the strict enclosure, pointing to repeated admonitions against wandering. Others emphasize the opulent gardens with fountains, libraries with illuminated books, guest halls lavish enough to rival small castles. Perhaps they were both at once, spaces of control that still allowed flashes of freedom, enough to fuel both envy and scandal. Imagine a royal court buzzing with gossip, whispers of a duke's daughter who receives too many letters, or a princess who slips out to visit a shrine without permission. The stories grow, embroidered with detail, until they resemble tales of liaisons and escapades. Whether true or not, the damage was the same. Convents became stages where noble reputations were tested, sometimes destroyed. One peculiar case involved the daughter of a French count accused of enticing others with her glances during public worship. The charge is vague, almost absurd, yet it was repeated enough to stick. The idea of a high-born nun tempting both visitors and sisters alike captured imaginations too eager for scandal to resist. As the imagery fades, you sense how royal blood complicated convent life. For ordinary nuns, transgression was a personal failing. For noble ones, it became a political weapon. Desire, rumor, and power intertwined, creating stories that have lingered in chronicles long after the names of most sisters were forgotten. And so, behind the heavy cloister gates, noble daughters lived lives that were both privileged and perilous, watched, whispered about, and transformed into legends of scandal that no vow of silence could erase. The whispers of noble scandal dissolve into the hum of footsteps on gravel paths, and now your thoughts wander toward the uneasy boundary between convent and road. Convents were not sealed tombs. They stood as way stations for travelers, merchants, and pilgrims. Hospitality was a Christian duty, and many nunneries offered beds, meals, and prayer for strangers. Yet where strangers entered, temptation often followed. Archival evidence suggests that certain convents, especially those situated along pilgrimage routes, maintained guest houses where lay people and religious shared space. Documents mention rules about segregating men from the cloister proper, but the mere need for such separation points to how porous the boundaries were. Pilgrims, weary from the road, often sought comfort that went beyond bread and water. One peculiar report from a visitation in the Rhineland scolds a community for allowing pilgrims into the convent garden, where excessive familiarity was observed. The language is cautious, but it conjures images of whispered conversations under trees, perhaps hands clasped longer than allowed. Inspectors interpreted this as disorder. For the women, it may have been an intoxicating glimpse of the outside world. Historians remain split over whether convent hospitality was genuinely dangerous or whether fears of impropriety were exaggerated. Some argue that the arrival of outsiders was a welcome distraction in cloisters that otherwise offered few new faces. Others suggest that clerical authorities magnified rumors, projecting anxieties about female chastity onto the inevitable mingling of guests and hosts. The debate continues, unresolved. For a moment, it feels as though you stand at the convent gate. The bell has just rung, announcing travelers seeking shelter. A lay sister swings the iron latch, and figures shuffle in. Dusty feet, cloaks damp from rain, the scent of sweat and foreign spices clinging to them. The nuns, curious yet cautious, keep their eyes low, though glances dart quickly toward unfamiliar faces. In your ears the sounds of the guest house rise, wooden bowls clattering, voices murmuring in accents from faraway towns, the scrape of benches pulled close. Among these noises is something subtler, the hush of conversation between one nun and a pilgrim seated too near. You cannot hear the words, but the tone suggests more than charity. A striking anecdote appears in the chronicle of a Spanish bishop who complained that certain nunneries had become as lively as inns, with laughter and music drifting across their walls. His outrage is telling. If joy alone was cause for censure, perhaps something deeper was suspected. The image of cloisters ringing with song blurs the line between sanctuary and tavern. Consider also the confessional role of pilgrims. Many brought stories of shrines, relics, and miracles, recounting wonders to captivated audiences. Yet their tales often included bawdy humor and courtly love songs, slipping into convent walls under the guise of entertainment. These narratives could awaken desires that the cloister tried to keep dormant. Some researchers believe that gifts exchanged during such visits carried hidden meanings, tokens of devotion, flowers plucked from roadside shrines, or small carved figures. One confiscated item, noted in a 15th century visitation, was a wooden brooch shaped like a heart, given by a traveller to a nun. Officials burned it as vanity, but its symbolism lingers in the record. Picture the garden after dusk. A pilgrim leans against the wall, humming a song learned on the road. A sister, veiled but restless, lingers nearby under pretense of gathering herbs. Their eyes meet, and in the briefest silence, the rules of enclosure tremble. She retreats quickly, but the memory of his gaze carries back into her prayers that night. Interpretations differ as to whether such moments were isolated sparks or common patterns. Some convents reinforced their gates with iron after repeated scandals, while others continued to host travelers openly, as if confident in their discipline. The truth likely lies in the middle, where duty and desire coexisted uneasily, each visit carrying both risk and relief. As the scene fades, you realize that the convent was never as closed as its walls suggested. Pilgrims carried the outside world into its heart, stirring longings that rules could not entirely suppress. Hospitality, meant to display Christian virtue, became a doorway through which temptation stepped softly but insistently. And so, the convent gate lingers in your imagination, its hinges creaking with every arrival. Each visitor a reminder that beyond stone walls lay lives, bodies, and stories too tempting to ignore. The creak of the convent gate fades, and your imagination slips into a quieter place, the scriptorium, where the smell of ink and parchment hangs heavy, and the only sound is the steady scratching of quills. Here, amid lines of holy text, another kind of voice sometimes emerged, the scribal margins. What was supposed to be sacred copying occasionally erupted into doodles, jokes, and startling hints of the forbidden. Inventories of medieval manuscripts reveal that many convents copied psalters, breviaries, and devotional texts. The official words were solemn, yet when modern scholars examined the margins, they sometimes found images of animals, jesters, and even bawdy sketches tucked between prayers. These were not always drawn by monks. Nuns, too, had access to parchment and quill, and their hands left traces that resist silence. One remarkable aside comes from a 13th century manuscript preserved in Vienna. Amid pages of psalms, a figure appears, two women drawn side by side, their veils slipping, one reaching toward the other's hand. The sketch is crude but unmistakable, hidden beneath a flourish of vines as if camouflaged from prying eyes. To a casual reader, it might seem decorative. To a careful one, it whispers more. Interpretations remain divided. Some scholars insist these doodles were humorous, meant only to lighten endless hours of copying. Others argue they betray suppressed thoughts, moments when the pen slipped into desire. Researchers cannot agree whether to treat them as jokes, rebellions, or confessions etched in ink. For a moment, it feels as though you are seated in that scriptorium. Your back aches from the bench, your fingers smudged with black ink. The candle sputters, making shadows leap across the page. Your pen hovers over the margin, and though you are meant to draw only a flower, it slowly becomes a face you know too well. You hesitate, heart racing, but the urge to leave her image on the page outweighs the fear of discovery. In your ears, the rhythm of quills scratching becomes hypnotic. Between the steady strokes, you hear soft giggles as another sister sketches a tiny animal in the corner of her text. To an outsider, it looks harmless. To those inside, it is a secret language, a way of speaking desire without words. One peculiar record notes that inspectors occasionally confiscated manuscripts with decorations unsuitable for holy reading. The phrase leaves everything to the imagination, but the mere fact that such confiscations occurred suggests more than careless doodling. Perhaps the pages carried drawings too bold, or notes that strayed from devotion into something else entirely. Think, too, of coded words. Some nuns wrote acrostic poems where the first letters of each line spelled out names, hidden in plain sight. To a casual reader, it was piety. To the intended, it was unmistakable. In one surviving psalter, the name of a fellow sister appears down the margin, disguised as initials within Latin verses. Historians speculate that these small acts of inscription gave women a sense of control over their own story. In a world where their voices were often filtered through male confessors or bishops, the margin became their stage. Here they could flirt with the forbidden, safe in the ambiguity of ink. Picture the discovery centuries later. A scholar turns a brittle page and finds a doodle of intertwined hands. He debates whether it was idle amusement or hidden confession. The image, crude yet deliberate, outlives both fear and secrecy. What once was a risk becomes, for us, a tantalizing glimpse of intimacy disguised as ornament. And so, the scriptorium lingers in your thoughts, a chamber of silence where voices whispered through ink, where holy words framed playful, even sensual sketches. The margins, small as they are, remind you that desire will find a way to leave its mark, even in the holiest of books. The ink-stained margins fade from your sight, and now your mind drifts to the broader rules that governed convents themselves. Stone walls were never enough. Statutes and constitutions attempted to codify every hour of a nun's day, from rising at dawn to kneeling at dusk. Yet the rules varied sharply between orders, and within the cracks of difference, strange liberties could slip. Constitutional texts attest that Benedictine houses, among the oldest, permitted relative freedom compared to later reforming orders. Their nuns might speak more freely, walk in gardens, and even interact with visitors on certain feast days. By contrast, Cistercian reforms imposed far stricter enclosure, insisting that women live in silence, behind grills, and away from the eyes of the world. The divergence left room for both accusation and creativity. An intriguing anecdote appears in the register of an archbishop visiting a Benedictine house in the 13th century. He complained that sisters there received guests too warmly and with too many gestures of delight. The phrasing is coy, yet it suggests behavior not tolerated under Cistercian watch. The inspector condemned it as laxity. The women might have seen it simply as hospitality. Researchers remain divided on how meaningful these differences were. Some argue that looser Benedictine rules encouraged intimacy and scandal, while Cistercian austerity left little chance for transgression. Others counter that stricter rules only heightened temptation, making the smallest infraction more charged. Interpretations vary, with no consensus on whether structure or severity made convents more susceptible to whispered desire. For a moment, it feels as though you walk from one cloister into another. In the Benedictine hall, laughter hums under candlelight, voices mingling over shared meals. A visitor greets a nun with warmth, and her smile lingers a second too long. Cross the boundary into a Cistercian house, and the silence is absolute. Faces remain lowered, hands clasped, yet behind that rigor, the imagination hums even louder. In your ears the contrast resounds. In one convent, the scrape of benches pulled together for feasting. In the other, only the rustle of habits against stone as women file wordlessly past. Yet in both, the potential for longing remains. The rules change the form, not the fact. A curious marginal note from a canon lawyer adds another layer. He observed that overly strict rules sometimes breed rebellions of the flesh, while leniency permits liberties unbecoming. His conclusion: neither system prevented scandal. Desire slipped around statutes like water around stone. Imagine a novice weighing her choices. In a Benedictine house, she risks laughter turning into something more. In a Cistercian cloister, she risks madness from silence, her mind inventing images to fill the void. Which path is safer? Perhaps neither, for both end in the same whispered confessions, the same tremors of forbidden longing. The debate endures among historians. Was freedom more dangerous than restriction, or was restriction itself the fuel? The answer may lie in the fact that complaints surface from both kinds of convents, suggesting that no rule could fully contain human impulse. And so, as you wander mentally between these cloisters, you realize that structure itself was less important than the unchanging truth. The heart remained untamed, and every regulation only gave it a new shape in which to hide. The contrast of Benedictine freedom and Cistercian austerity fades, and your mind drifts toward a mystery that startled many inspectors: the presence of infants inside cloister walls. In theory, the convent was a place of chastity, cut off from the world. Yet archival evidence shows repeated mentions of wet nurses, cradles, and even complaints about babies crying during prayer. Their very existence raised troubling questions. Administrative registers confirm that some convents maintained nurseries, justified as charity for foundlings. Orphans left at the gate were taken in, sometimes raised until adoption. Yet records also note cases where infants were born within enclosure. These phrases appear sparingly, but they hint at scandals that church authorities preferred not to name outright. One extraordinary case is recorded in a 15th century visitation from Brabant. The bishop discovered 2 infants and scolded the abbess for failing to explain their parentage. Her vague defense that they were gifts from God entrusted to our care convinced no one. The record ends abruptly, as though the scribe hesitated to write what everyone already suspected. Interpretations among historians remain sharply divided. Some see these infants as evidence of clandestine liaisons between nuns and confessors, guards, or visitors. Others argue that the convents were convenient refuges for noble families who placed illegitimate children there under cover of piety. Still, others insist that accusations of births were exaggerated slanders meant to discredit female houses. No single explanation satisfies all the evidence. For a moment, it feels as though you hear the sound yourself, a baby's cry echoing in the cloister, sharp against the usual silence of psalms. The sisters shift nervously on their benches, eyes darting, as though the child's wail is louder than any accusation. The air smells faintly of milk, an aroma strikingly out of place among wax, incense, and stone. In your ears, the noise of lullabies joins the usual rhythm of chant. A nun hums quietly, rocking a cradle, while her companions recite the office. The overlap is uncanny, maternal tenderness, wrapped in the liturgical schedule. One startling aside appears in a London visitation of 1479. Officials scolded a convent for nurses and children within the walls, to the great scandal of the faithful. The phrasing is revealing. The scandal was not the children themselves, but the suspicion of how they arrived there. Scholars who study these episodes suggest that the presence of infants forced convents to confront the contradiction at their heart. A house of virgins caring for newborns blurred the line between charity and transgression. Were they saviors of foundlings, or participants in illicit liaisons? The answer then as now remains uncertain. You picture a novice assigned to care for such a child. She dips linen into warmed goat's milk, gently feeding the infant as she rocks on a wooden stool. Her veil slips slightly, her expression softened. Around her, the convent continues with its routine, but in her cell, life pulses differently. The tiny heartbeat in her arms reminds her of a world from which she was supposed to be walled away. A curious note in one prioress's account book even records expenses for linen swaddling and milk, hidden between entries for candles and bread. The matter-of-fact listing suggests these things were routine, not exceptional, which leaves you to wonder, how many such children grew up briefly in cloisters, then vanished into silence? The image lingers as you drift further, convents built as sanctuaries of chastity, yet echoing with the cries of babies. Whether those cries were proof of charity or evidence of scandal is a question the centuries have never fully resolved. The faint cries of infants fade from your mind, and now you hear another kind of voice, the low murmur of confessors visiting the cloister. These men, meant to guide souls, became entangled in webs of intimacy that were not always spiritual. The convent door opened for them alone, and their authority as confessors made them both guardians and potential tempters. Ecclesiastical records indicate that confessors were required by canon law to serve communities of nuns. They preached, heard confessions, and administered the sacraments. In theory, they were carefully chosen men of impeccable reputation. In practice, repeated decrees warn against undue familiarity, proof that boundaries blurred far too often. An arresting anecdote survives from a 14th century visitation in Cologne, where inspectors reprimanded a Dominican friar for lingering in the parlour with one sister far too long. The report omits detail, yet its very vagueness hints at something beyond pastoral care. To the bishop, it was scandal. To the nun, perhaps, it was the only intimacy her vows allowed. Scholarly interpretations diverge sharply. Some researchers stress that these stories were exaggerated by hostile outsiders, eager to discredit women's houses. Others emphasize the danger of proximity, private confessions spoken in whispers, where secrecy could become cover for forbidden exchange. Still others view it as mutual, priests seeking closeness, and women starved for tenderness, each using the confessional as an alibi. The arguments remain unsettled, and perhaps intentionally blurred. For a moment, it feels as though you are kneeling in that dim corner of the convent chapel. A wooden screen divides you from the confessor, yet his breath filters through, warm and close. He whispers absolution, but the tone carries something softer, almost conspiratorial. Your pulse quickens as you wonder if he hears it. The sounds in your ears deepen, the scrape of a stool, the shift of fabric as the confessor leans forward, the whisper of penance murmured too low for others to catch. The ritual's very secrecy makes it feel perilously intimate. One peculiar note from a Carthusian manual warned priests that women's words must be cut short lest affection arise. The admonition tells you everything. It assumes the danger is not hypothetical but expected. A confessor who lingered too long risked entangling himself in more than spiritual matters. Imagine, too, the perspective of the priest. For him, entering the cloister meant stepping into a world entirely female, where his presence carried both authority and allure. To some, this power proved intoxicating. For others, it became a heavy burden, as they struggled to maintain distance in a place where every whisper might become rumor. There are stories of confessors exchanging coded gifts with nuns, small objects blessed under the guise of devotion, but treasured as tokens of affection. A rosary bead, a slip of parchment with a single verse, even a fragment of cloth. Each item, innocuous to outsiders, carried layers of meaning to those who shared them. Historians puzzle over whether these men were predators exploiting vulnerability or confidants caught in mutual longing. Perhaps both were true, depending on the case. The sources do not decide for us. They only preserve the unease, the suspicion, the tantalizing suggestion of what passed behind the grille. You picture the chapel at dusk, the confessor departing through the gate. His cloak rustles, his shadow stretches across the stone floor. A nun watches silently from behind the bars of the choir screen, her lips parted as if she might call after him. But the words die, leaving only silence thick enough to feel. And so, visiting confessors become figures of paradox, symbols of discipline, yet also of temptation, charged with policing desire, yet often accused of igniting it. The stories of their entanglements remind you that the convent was never free from the very human pull of closeness, even when cloaked in the language of sin and salvation. The memory of whispered confessions fades, and now your thoughts shift to the punishments that followed when convent discipline slipped. Behind the stone walls, correction was meant to restore purity, yet sometimes the rituals of shame themselves carried an unsettling charge. Imagine the refectory emptied of food and filled instead with silence as one sister is brought forward, stripped not of her veil but of her dignity. Ecclesiastical statutes show that punishments for nuns ranged from fasting and silence to public penance. A common penalty involved exposure, a sister forced to kneel in the chapter house, bareheaded, sometimes in only her shift, while the rest of the community looked on. The intent was humiliation, but in practice the ritual made the body visible in ways daily life tried to conceal. An arresting incident is recorded in a 15th century English visitation. One nun accused of intimacies unsuited to her station was ordered to stand barefoot before the altar for an entire mass. The chronicler noted she trembled and wept, but also that eyes lingered too long upon her. His discomfort leaks through the ink, as though he saw that punishment had produced its own temptations. Scholarly opinion divides here as well. Some interpret these exposures as straightforward discipline, harsh but necessary. Others argue that such staged humiliations risked transforming shame into spectacle, offering a voyeuristic thrill even within sacred walls. Researchers remain undecided whether these rituals policed desire or unwittingly performed it. For a moment, it feels as though you are seated among the community, watching as the punished sister kneels. The stone floor is cold beneath her knees. Her white shift clings in the damp air. She bows her head, but the outline of her shoulders beneath linen is impossible not to see. Around you, silence is heavy, charged with a tension no hymn can dissolve. In your ears, the sound is the shuffle of sandals as others pass by her, some eyes downcast, some stealing glances. A cough echoes too loudly, then subsides. The punishment is meant to shame her, but in the watching, the shame becomes strangely shared. One peculiar note from a Cistercian manual instructed abbesses to be cautious with penances, warning that what is meant to humble may instead inflame. That single line suggests officials recognized the risk. Discipline could provoke the very emotions it sought to curb. Some punishments involved the lash as well, applied not in solitude but before witnesses. A sister bent forward, her back struck in rhythm while psalms were sung. The mingling of pain, ritual, and observation was troubling even to some contemporaries. A canon lawyer wrote disapprovingly that such practices breed thoughts unbecoming, though he left those thoughts unnamed. Picture the punished nun afterward, returning to her cell in silence. Her cheeks are flushed, her body aching, yet her mind replays not only the sting of discipline but the awareness of eyes upon her. In a world where touch was forbidden, even the touch of punishment left traces that could not easily fade. Historians interpret these rituals in competing ways. Were they cruel tools of control, designed to crush individuality? Or were they paradoxical spaces where hidden desires surfaced under cover of correction? The sources leave room for both readings, and the ambiguity itself tells you something essential about life within cloister walls. And so, punitive exposure lingers in your imagination not only as discipline but as a strange theatre, where shame became spectacle, and spectacle, perhaps, stirred emotions the rulebooks never intended. The image of the punished sister kneeling in silence fades, and your imagination turns toward another world entirely. Markets bustling with relic sellers, pilgrims crowding around shrines, and the flow of objects said to carry holy power. Relics were meant to inspire devotion, yet when they entered convent walls, they could be pressed into uses no church statute anticipated. Inventories compiled during episcopal visitations list reliquaries of bone, hair, fragments of the true cross, even small vials of oil or water said to cure illness. These were meant for veneration, displayed on feast days, or used in solemn processions. But alongside these official uses, odd complaints emerge, suggesting that relics sometimes became strangely personal companions. One peculiar case is noted in a 15th century record from Normandy. Inspectors scolded a nun for keeping a reliquary always in her bed. Officially, she claimed it comforted her in prayer. Yet the language of the report carries unease. The relic was not simply kissed in devotion but clutched through the night. Whether for solace, protection, or something more tactile, no one could say. Interpretations vary widely. Some scholars emphasize the devotional intensity of medieval piety, reminding us that touching relics was understood as drawing close to heaven. Others argue that proximity could shift into sensual attachment, especially in cloisters where physical intimacy was otherwise forbidden. Researchers cannot agree whether these stories reflect genuine misuse or only clerical suspicion magnified into scandal. For a moment, it feels as though you are in a small stone cell, watching a sister lift a jeweled reliquary from her table. She presses it first to her lips, then against her chest, eyes closed in rapture. The candlelight gleams across gilt surfaces, but the look on her face suggests something deeper than reverence. The sounds in your ears are subtle, the faint creak of wood as she shifts on her pallet, the tiny click of glass against metal as the reliquary moves. Each sound resonates more loudly than a hymn, for the silence makes it intimate. An unusual aside comes from the pen of an Augustinian reformer who complained that some nuns lavish more kisses upon saints' bones than upon the altar. His words were meant as rebuke, yet they reveal how closely physical gestures of devotion resembled gestures of desire. Consider also the trade in smaller souvenirs. Pilgrims often left tokens, wax images, little crucifixes, or beads touched to shrines. These objects found their way into convents, where sisters treasured them in ways authorities could not control. A confiscation list from a German abbey even included a small carved figure, indecorously worn upon the body. The scribe refused to elaborate, but the implication is difficult to miss. Some historians suggest relic markets themselves blurred the sacred and sensual. Bones were sold with exaggerated promises, oils with supposed healing properties that doubled as lubricants or perfumes. When these items entered cloister walls, they carried both faith and fantasy. You imagine the convent parlor after a relic has arrived. Sisters crowd close, eager to touch or kiss the object. The air fills with incense and anticipation. In that crush of bodies and fervor, boundaries may blur, hands brushing, lips lingering, emotions rising. Desire cloaked itself in ritual, making it invisible to outsiders yet undeniable to those within. As the scene fades, the relic market leaves a lasting impression. Objects meant to elevate the spirit often entangled the body instead, showing once more how devotion and longing were never far apart in cloistered life. The glitter of jeweled reliquaries fades, And now your thoughts settle on the figures who claimed not just relics but visions, women whose ecstatic trances drew attention far beyond their convent walls. Mystical rivals were both admired and distrusted, their bodies becoming battlegrounds where sanctity and suspicion collided. Ecclesiastical documents describe nuns who fell into trances during prayer, trembling, sighing, and speaking in voices not their own. These experiences were sometimes celebrated as proof of holiness. Yet when more than one mystic lived in the same house, competition arose. Each claimed unique access to divine presence, and with it came whispers of envy, exaggeration, and sometimes scandal. One striking example comes from a 15th-century Italian convent, where two sisters were famed for their visions. According to a chronicler, one collapsed before the altar, claiming Christ embraced her, while the other spoke of angels kissing her mouth with fire. The community split in loyalty, some believing one, some the other. Inspectors noted unease, remarking that gestures of the body caused distraction among the sisters. Interpretations among historians diverge. Some see these visions as genuine mystical traditions, deeply rooted in devotional culture. Others suspect they were shaped, perhaps even coached, by confessors who guided the language into bridal and erotic imagery. Still, others argue that rivalry itself pushed the women to intensify their displays, making them more dramatic, more physical, in order to outshine their companions. The scholarly community remains divided, with no single reading sufficient. For a moment it feels as though you are inside the crowded chapel, watching one woman sway, her arms stretched wide as if embracing someone unseen. Her breath comes fast, her cheeks flushed. Across the choir, another sister stares with narrowed eyes, then suddenly drops to her knees, gasping out her own revelation. The atmosphere is tense, part worship, part theatre. In your ears the sounds overlap. The thud of knees hitting stone, the sharp inhale of breath, the murmured prayers of onlookers unsure whether to be awed or alarmed. Each gasp or cry pulls attention, creating a contest of devotion that is also, strangely, a contest of desire. One peculiar marginal note in a confessor's diary laments that such rivalries draw eyes to the body rather than to the soul. The choice of words is telling. Whatever their intentions, the women's movements captivated their sisters in ways that blurred admiration with attraction. Picture the aftermath. In the refectory, whispers spread. Some say Sister Agnes was truly embraced by Christ. Others claim Sister Lucia staged her collapse. Their rivalry is not only spiritual, it unsettles daily life, turning meals, prayers, even silence into arenas of comparison. The convent becomes a stage, every gesture scrutinized, every sigh interpreted as either divine or deceptive. Scholars suggest that these visionary contests expose the vulnerability of cloistered communities. A single woman's trance could reshape discipline, draw pilgrims, and even attract donations. But it could also spark jealousy, doubts, and rumors of the erotic. The balance between sanctity and scandal teetered with every vision. As the chapel fades from view, the image of rival mystics lingers. Their bodies swayed between heaven and earth, and in their rivalry you glimpse the fragile line where devotion became performance, and performance carried undertones the rulebook could never erase. The chapel echoes of competing visions fade, and your steps drift outward again into the cloister garden. Here the air is softer, filled with the scents of thyme, mint, and roses climbing against stone walls. The walled garden was meant as a space of meditation, a retreat where sisters could contemplate creation. Yet it also became one of the few places where secrecy and intimacy were possible, sheltered by hedges and the heavy perfume of herbs. Monastic statutes mention the garden as a site of labor. Nuns cultivated vegetables, fruit trees, and medicinal herbs for daily use. But the very layout enclosed, shaded, threaded with hidden corners made it easy for rules of enclosure to loosen. A visitation record from a German convent in the early 15th century notes sternly that sisters walk in the garden 2 by 2 with gestures unbecoming. The language leaves much to the imagination, but the warning speaks volumes. An evocative case emerges from an Italian chronicle, where the abbess of Santa Chiara was accused of allowing certain sisters to tarry too long among the vines. The charge is vague, but the implication is clear. Secluded spaces offered temptations that the cloister walls could not entirely block. Historians remain divided over the significance of these garden encounters. Some view them as innocent leisure, condemned only by overzealous inspectors. Others interpret them as opportunities for whispered intimacy, cloaked by the fragrance of herbs and the rustle of leaves. The scholarly community cannot decide whether these accusations were exaggerations or glimpses of lived reality. For a moment, it feels as though you are standing beneath a fig tree at dusk. The air is damp, petals fallen onto the path, their perfume rising in the cooling night. Two sisters sit close on a wooden bench, their shoulders touching lightly. They speak too softly to hear, but their laughter drifts like music above the chirp of crickets. In your ears the sounds mingle, the hiss of wind through tall grass, the faint creak of the bench as bodies lean closer, the muted hum of bees lingering late among lavender blooms. Every ordinary noise acquires a new intimacy in the hush of twilight. One curious aside survives in the notes of a confessor who scolded sisters for plucking roses and wearing them in their veils. He complained it was a vanity that led to much fondness. His irritation suggests that the flowers were more than decoration, they became tokens exchanged, small symbols of affection hidden beneath a guise of piety. Picture the garden by moonlight. The walls loom high, but the shadows offer cover. A novice steals a sprig of mint and presses it into another's palm. Fingers linger longer than necessary. Breath mingles, scented by the herb. The garden, meant to recall paradise, becomes instead a theatre of whispered longing. Scholars suggest that these spaces reveal how desire in convents was often linked to sensory experience. The scent of herbs, the feel of damp grass underfoot, the warmth of another body in close proximity, all heightened awareness in ways the rule-book never considered. Whether inspectors condemned or ignored it, the garden carried possibilities too fragrant to suppress. And so, the walled garden remains in your imagination, not only a place of labor and meditation, but also a sanctuary for quiet encounters. Within its scented air, rules bent easily, and desire found a way to bloom, as inevitable as roses climbing against ancient stone. The fragrance of roses and herbs drifts away, and your thoughts turn to something heavier, darker, the fear of the world ending. Medieval convents, like the towns around them, lived under the shadow of apocalyptic expectation. Plagues swept through villages, comets streaked across the sky, famines killed without warning. Within cloister walls, these events were read as divine warnings, and fear of the world's collapse sometimes led women into desperate, intimate experiments with their own bodies and with each other. Annals from the 14th century show how the Black Death unsettled convent life. Whole communities were reduced to half their number, prayers filled the nights, and fasting turned severe. Yet reports also mention strange excesses during those years, hinting that terror of imminent death loosened discipline. When tomorrow might never come, vows felt less binding. One haunting anecdote comes from a convent in Lübeck during the plague years. An inspector complained that sisters gave themselves to embraces as though the world would end that very hour. His disgust is plain, but beneath it lies the recognition of panic, transformed into passion, fear, and desire, mingling in a single act of defiance against mortality. Interpretations among historians remain unsettled. Some argue these reports reflect genuine outbreaks of hysteria, when terror fueled reckless behavior. Others suggest they are exaggerations, part of a long tradition of blaming women for disorder during crises. A third view sees them as coded references to practices the clergy dared not name, especially when cloister walls hid what outsiders could only imagine. For a moment, it feels as though you are in that convent dormitory during a plague year. The bell tolls in town, announcing yet another burial. The sisters kneel at their bedsides, but one suddenly collapses against another, sobbing. The embrace deepens, both women clinging as though the stone walls themselves might crumble. The air smells of vinegar and herbs, meant to ward off infection, but beneath it lingers the musk of sweat and fear. In your ears, the sound of prayers overlaps with the ragged rhythm of breath. The voices chant psalms, yet their cadence grows unsteady, as if grief has slid into something else, an urgency to feel alive while death circles outside the gates. One extraordinary aside survives from a 15th century chronicle, where a nun confessed she had sought sweetness in the arms of my sisters, believing judgment near. The text is fragmentary, written hastily, but its honesty is stark. To her, intimacy was not rebellion but preparation for the end, an act of comfort in the face of annihilation. Apocalyptic fear did not end with plague. Astrological events, the Great Comet of 1347, eclipses, earthquakes were all read as omens. Some convents responded with stricter discipline, flagellation, and endless vigils. Others, according to complaints, fell into unseemly levity, laughter and embraces erupting in moments of crisis. Whether grief or desire, both were amplified by the sense that time itself was running out. Historians debate whether this panic led to lasting changes in cloister practice. Some believe it fueled mysticism, giving rise to more visions of marriage with Christ. Others argue it simply exposed what was already present, desire lurking beneath discipline, waiting for fear to unseal it. You picture a chapel filled with women singing the Dies Irae, voices trembling as thunder rolls outside. A novice clutches her neighbor's hand, not letting go even when the hymn ends. That small gesture carries the weight of the world's collapse, a need for human warmth stronger than fear of sin. And so, apocalyptic fears cast their own kind of permission inside convent walls. When the end seemed near, boundaries wavered, and desire broke through, as unstoppable as death itself. The tolling of the Dies Irae fades from your imagination, and now you find yourself in the harsh light of official judgment. Not all convent secrets remained whispers within walls, some spilled out into trials, scandals recorded in detail that still survives in court registers. When accusations reached episcopal courts or even secular tribunals, the language grew sharper, but also strangely revealing. Judicial archives demonstrate how ecclesiastical officials pursued cases of misconduct with meticulous care. Inspectors recorded testimonies, often pried from frightened novices or resentful servants. These documents, though shaped by politics and moralizing, give rare glimpses into moments of exposure that the convent itself could not contain. One notorious case from 15th century Utrecht describes an abbess accused of encouraging carnal affections among her sisters. Witnesses claimed she embraced women during vigils, kissing them and declaring it holy union. The trial records, though damning, also preserve the words of the accused. What harm is there if love binds us closer to God? Her defense shocked the clerics, who condemned her, yet her statement still burns on the parchment. Interpretations among modern scholars diverge. Some argue such trials reflect genuine misconduct evidence, that intimacy thrived behind cloister walls. Others believe they were fueled by political motives, attempts to seize convent lands or replace abbesses who resisted episcopal control. Still others see in these accusations projections of male fear, where female affection was framed as deviance to reinforce authority. Debate continues, unresolved. For a moment, it feels as though you are seated in that court chamber. The air is thick with sweat, ink, and the metallic tang of sealing wax. A nun stands trembling before stern men, her veil pulled low but her voice audible. She swears her actions were pure, but her flushed cheeks betray another story, or perhaps only nervous fear. The scratching of quills on parchment seems louder than her words, capturing fragments of her life forever. In your ears the sound of testimony echoes, halting phrases, reluctant admissions, and the occasional sob. The rhythm of questioning grows harsh, while the silence of the accused speaks louder than any denial. Every sentence feels rehearsed, Yet beneath the caution you sense the truth pressing against the surface. One fascinating aside comes from English records. A servant testified that she saw sisters lying together in the dormitory as man and wife. The court seized on the phrasing, but historians note how formulaic it sounds, as though coached or exaggerated. Still, once written, the words took on a life of their own, blackening reputations and reshaping convent history. Picture the aftermath. Punishments varied from penance and stricter enclosure to outright dissolution of houses tainted by scandal. In some cases, abbesses were deposed, novices expelled, property seized. For the women, the verdict meant more than shame. It meant the collapse of their entire way of life. Yet even in condemnation, the records preserve traces of intimacy too vivid to erase. Scholars emphasize the paradox. These trials sought to suppress desire, but in writing down accusations they immortalized it. The very acts meant to silence nuns gave them a strange, reluctant voice in history. Their kisses, embraces, and whispered words, though condemned, became part of the archival record, surviving centuries longer than their prayers. And so, courtrooms and scandal sheets join cloisters and gardens as stages of desire. Within the cold Latin of judicial records, you glimpse bodies trembling, voices breaking, and passions too strong to remain hidden. The voices of courts and tribunals fade, and what remains is softer echoes that linger not in statutes or judgments, but in whispered legacies. Long after the medieval centuries ended, tales of nuns and their secret practices drifted through chronicles, sermons, and eventually into folklore. The convent, imagined as a fortress of purity, also became a stage for fantasies about desire, secrecy, and scandal that refused to disappear. Chroniclers of the late Middle Ages sometimes embellished older rumors, weaving stories of disordered houses where vows collapsed under temptation. These tales circulated in pulpits, not always to correct but to entertain, stirring both outrage and titillation. Reformation pamphlets later seized on such accounts, amplifying every whispered failure as proof that celibacy was unnatural. The image of the errant nun entered popular imagination and never quite left. One curious anecdote appears in a 16th century satire, where a nun is depicted writing love letters by candlelight, her habit half slipped, while a devil grins behind her shoulder. Though exaggerated, the story drew from centuries of genuine complaints, reworking them into moral theatre for readers eager to feel both pious and scandalized. Interpretations among scholars remain diverse. Some see these whispered legacies as propaganda, exaggerating rare events into symbols of corruption. Others argue they preserve distorted but real memories of women navigating longing in confined spaces. Still others emphasize how the endurance of these stories reflects society's unease with female autonomy, desire, and secrecy. The debate endures, mirroring the very ambiguity of the sources themselves. For a moment, it feels as though you are sitting beside an old storyteller in a dim tavern centuries later. He leans close, whispering of nuns who met at midnight, of gardens filled with laughter, of letters burned before discovery. His voice lowers, and though you know he exaggerates, you also sense that some kernel of truth glows within the tale. In your ears, the sound is quieter now. The fading of bells, the hush of pages turning, the sigh of memory itself. What was once scandal becomes myth, retold until the line between fact and fantasy dissolves entirely. A striking footnote comes from a 17th century antiquarian who, after poring over old visitation records, remarked, "The truth of these matters is lost, yet the smoke of their fire remains." His words capture the essence. What we inherit are shadows, shaped by fear, by fascination, and by the persistent allure of the forbidden. And so, the story drifts into its final hush. You have walked through cloisters, dormitories, chapels, and gardens. You have heard the echoes of visions, punishments, and scandals. Whether entirely true or partly imagined, these accounts remind you that even behind the strictest walls, humanity persisted longing, faltering, and leaving traces that centuries could not erase. Now, As the final echoes fade, let your body loosen into rest. The harsh clang of courtrooms softens into the distant murmur of night winds. Stone walls crumble into nothing more than quiet shadows in your imagination. You are left not with judgment or scandal, but with a sense of how fleeting and human these stories always were. The nuns you have followed across centuries, some laughing in gardens, some trembling in visions, some scolded in courts, were human beings caught between vows and longings. They lived in silence, yet left whispers strong enough to reach your ears tonight. Those whispers do not accuse or excuse. They simply remind you of how complex the human heart is, even when bound by rules meant to tame it. Let your breathing slow as you picture a cloister at dusk, not filled with scandal, but with calm. A single candle flickers in a window. Herbs sway gently in the garden. The chapel is empty, save for the quiet hum of crickets outside. No inspectors arrive, no courts convene, only the stillness of stone and the comfort of routine prayer. Your eyes grow heavy as you imagine the slow rhythm of footsteps along the cloister walk, steady as your heartbeat. The whispers of scandal turn into nothing more than distant echoes dissolving into sleep. All that remains is the sense of time passing, centuries flowing like water, carrying away fear and leaving peace behind. And with that, your journey comes to rest. The nuns fade into memory, the candles gutter out, and you drift deeper into the soft, dark, quiet, sweet dreams.